Hello, welcome to Standpoint's webinar, Safety Planning with Underserved Populations. Murray Banks, our Underserved Population Support Advocate, will be presenting today. I am Ty Cinnabon, Advocate Support Program Manager, and I will be helping to facilitate today's webinar. If you go into the chat box, I have uploaded the PowerPoint for today, so you can go ahead and open that up, save it if you want to. Also, you can follow along the PowerPoint with Murray. Like I said, I am going to be facilitating today's webinar, so if you have any questions, go ahead and type it in the question and answer box, and I will bring those up to Murray as I see them and when the timing is appropriate.
Alrighty. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Bonjour. My name is Murray. I'm the Underserved Population Support Advocate, and I am going to be doing some 101 basic information on safety planning with underserved populations. And I'm going to be touching on and providing examples on a variety of different underserved populations, since there's many different types of identities and experiences that we come into contact with. So my goal is to walk through a general outline and to provide examples for culturally specific or identity specific situations and experiences, so that you know what to look for and what to be aware of when you're developing a safety plan with a client. So the goals of the presentation are to break down important steps in safety planning. Y'all should have a really good idea of what a safety plan is, so I won't spend too much time in that. But we'll also be analyzing ways in which standard safety plans are not always helpful to the experiences of certain underserved populations. I'll be describing barriers to consider when developing a safety plan, and some helpful tips and resources for safety planning for both DV and SV. And the tips and resources that I have used myself and I find to be very helpful. And I'm going to be talking a lot about how you can customize a standard safety plan that you might have at your organization and add in things that are appropriate for the individual that you're working with. So I have a lot of resources throughout the PowerPoint. I've hyperlinked all of them. The majority of the resources that I have are templates, so they're in PDF form. And I also have some links to websites for more detail and information if you need. So a little bit about my experience with safety planning. I've had a variety of different positions. So I started out as a medical advocate. So in the ER, you're focusing more on immediate safety and leaving the ER, planning for emotional safety, and referring to community advocacy. And mental health, when I worked at the inpatient facility, you're focusing more on internal triggers, managing triggers, practicing skills learned in therapy, and really managing your emotional response to things. And suicide risk, so hotline safety planning and using mostly motivational interviewing as a de-escalation technique. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So I've had experiences with different types of safety plans, and I'm sure a lot of you have, and there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of intersections, but there's also a lot of differences. So part of my goal for this PowerPoint is to really give you a sense of the different types of safety plans that your clients might already be working with, and so that you can create something that's not too overwhelming for them. And a little disclaimer that I like to say in the beginning of the PowerPoint is that I'm speaking from my own personal experience as an advocate. And although I serve all underserved populations, I come from a very specific identity. So it's important not to utilize my webinar as the only webinar when you're looking for culturally specific or identity specific resources. I'm going to give you a lot of resources today, but it's important to stay up to date and to seek out other webinars or other resources that other people have, so that we have a well-rounded analysis and resource network that you're having when you're looking for folks from different underserved populations. Let me see here. Okay, so the standard safety plan. So when you're looking at a safety plan, a lot of your organizations have their own. So when you start a new position, a lot of the resources that they'll give you are safety plan templates. And I'll give you a couple of examples that might look familiar, but we all are given safety plan templates to use with our clients when we start a new position, or at least we should. And the goal of a safety plan, as we all know, is to obviously increase the safety, prepare for future encounters if there are any. This is creating an action plan for the individual, providing an opportunity for education and rapport building with your client, and to provide any referrals if needed. And one thing to note is that the safety plan should be guides and not checklists. So when you're working with a client, especially when you're a new advocate, you have a tendency to stick to the safety plan and fill out every single question that's being asked. And it seems very clinical, it seems very technical, and it's really uncomfortable for the client. And this is a skill that you'll develop over time, but it should be more of a conversation and less of a checklist, marking things off on a template. And another important thing to note is that there is a difference between a sexual violence safety plan and a domestic violence safety plan. And they have a lot of similarities, and that it seems tempting to utilize a DV safety plan for a sexual assault survivor. But there's a lot of things that you should consider when doing that, it really makes the person feel like their situation is not as bad as if they were experiencing a domestic violence situation. And a lot of issues that we have with especially dual organizations is blending the two too much, so that the sexual violence safety plans look too much like the domestic violence safety plans. And some of the differences between an SV versus a DV safety plan is there's a lack of personal information about the perpetrator. So if there's if the person who assaulted your client is not well known, if it's more of an acquaintance, then they might not know the name, the home or work address, their criminal history, their access to weapons, their risk level, anything that a individual who's experiencing domestic violence might know about their perpetrator. Usually domestic violence clients are very well informed on who's violating them or causing them harm, so that the safety plan would definitely be more catered to and have a lot more detail around making their environment safe from their perpetrator. Whereas a sexual violence victim might not have that information in order to develop a safety plan. So you would have to be a little bit more creative on general ways to keep someone safe and focus a lot more on internal and emotional supports when you're working with a sexual violence victim. Also, differences in the types of civil protection. So legal remedies will look different depending on the situation, if it's domestic or sexual violence. And another important thing to note is that everyone has different needs and access to resources. So a lot of what I'll talk about in this PowerPoint is barriers to access. So accessibility is something that's very common, and especially a lack of accessibility for folks who are from underserved populations. And it's good to get thinking about reasons why they might not be accessing certain services, or reasons why they can't access certain services when you're developing a safety plan, because you don't want to put something on there and assume that they are able to utilize that resource if they can't. So some types of safety plans. Usually this is there's a combination. So the templates at your organizations will have a combination of these types. I know when I started, my safety plan template that I was given was about 6 pages. So it was a huge safety plan, and it did have a combination of lists and checklists. So what I spoke about earlier, this checklist form of safety planning is very convenient if you are if you have very limited time with the individual, and if you have to kind of rush through a safety plan, if they're leaving, if they're being discharged, if they have to flee immediately. If you only have 10 minutes with the individual, checklists are really easy to just get the person thinking about things that they can take right away. What's the most important items that they can have? And this is good for the advocate because it really, if you happen to not forget something, or if you are unaware of certain things that they might need, this checklist system is really convenient and it's really helpful. Very user friendly. You're just marking off this is what you need. It applies to you. And the helpful contacts will usually have the local legal resource. We'll have law enforcement, hospitals, and community advocacy, as well as crisis lines. Those are usually specific to the area. So I know a lot of folks are in rural areas. So some of these lists might be smaller, some of them might be larger. And those are nice because it gives the individual variety of resources to utilize if they feel like they need them. They're just there for just in case, basically. None of it's not saying that they will be forced to contact any of these organizations, but it's nice to have lists of numbers for them if they need them. And one issue that I noticed in a lot of templates, safety planning for folks from underserved populations, is that there's not usually culturally specific resources. There's not any indicators of language accessibility. There's no languages listed, and there's no description on what kind of culturally specific resource is available to them if needed. There's no indicators showing safe services for our queer community. So usually there's very few identity specific resources available, but there are no indicators for a person who has not been out yet with their community, or who needs LGBTQIA2S+ specific resources. It's really helpful for the person to feel safe accessing those resources if there's an indicator on the contact list. And there's no descriptions. So like I said before, there's no little blurbs of what kind of resources are available. And it's just the number, which is good. You can put more on there with a lot more resources, but just having the name of an organization and a number is really daunting to some individuals, because the pressure and the fear around calling that organization and advocating for themselves and asking what kind of services are available is sometimes way too much, and you'll never get that phone call because a lot of people have anxiety about calling and asking questions. So there's usually just the name and the number, which is a con that I've noticed. Other types of safety plans are the write-ins. So it'll usually ask a question and then provide a few examples, and then it will allow you to write in your answer that is most appropriate for you, and fill in the blank. So it'll provide information, and then there's some education piece to it, and then there's a fill-in piece. So this is good for people to get them thinking about where they're going to stay, what they can do for their children, what kind of documents they need, emergency situations. So what kind of resources do they need in an emergency is usually what the fill-in is. And the examples that are provided are very general. It's very standard, and this is pretty consistent across all types of safety plans that I've seen anyway. And the problem with these are sometimes they might be too specific. So the examples provided might not be applicable to any part of the situation that the individual is experiencing. It's hard for also advocates who don't live the experience of the client to help with the fill-in portion because they're not aware of the barriers. They may not be aware of the conflicts and the issues and the safety concerns that someone might have of being a certain identity or from a certain culture in order to develop an individualized safety plan for them. And since a lot of these templates are not culturally specific or identity specific, it's not in the advocate's immediate attention or memory to consider the cultural barriers or the systemic issues that have and might impact the person's safety plan. You usually tend to default to the general examples. And that's not a bad thing, but it's also not a good thing either. So sometimes the safety plans are too vague, so they won't provide examples at all, and there's no indicators on any cultural or systemic issues that might be taken into consideration. Sometimes there's just a question and a blank line. And sometimes that's hard to think of ways to accommodate to the individual. And a lot of people have a tendency, especially if you're a newer advocate, it's more of a habit to, like I said, utilize every part of the safety plan. So even if it doesn't necessarily pertain to the individual, we still have a tendency to want to fill it in, just to create a more whole, complete looking safety plan for that individual. Even if it doesn't pertain to them in the moment, it might pertain to them in the future, so we keep it anyway, type thinking. And when you do that, it's hard to feel like you can make edits, to that you can take things out, that you can add or extend a safety plan that is more reflective of the experience of the individual. And another part of this is that a lot of individuals feel like a safety plan has to be written down. A safety plan has to be constructed within a template. And a lot of cultures are not used to that. A lot of them are spoken. A lot of them value more of a conversation than a checklist or a fill-in or a write-in, something that is physical on a piece of paper. A lot of the times it's more valuable to have a conversation that they can engage in and actually get thinking. It develops more of an autonomy and independence in the person, and you're also accommodating them to their style of communication by having that conversation as opposed to writing it down. So it's not that you're not doing your job when you're not giving them a template that they can bring with them. It's just an alternative way. And another thing about safety plans is that it's not something that can be given just once, especially when you're having conversations with people. As you know, as an advocate, you will have multiple conversations. You'll be constantly adjusting that safety plan, and it's not that the safety plan isn't working, it's just there are certain situations that have changed, there's different circumstances that are changing that need to be addressed in the safety plan. So if you're updating something 100 times, that doesn't mean it's not right. It means that it needs to be changed. And the goal of the safety plan should not be to change the behavior of the individual. It should to provide harm reduction in small and applicable amounts in the life that they're currently living. So we tend to be the goal in safety planning, there's a tendency to work towards complete and utter safety. And sometimes that's not realistic. So it's really important to adopt a harm reduction model when you're safety planning with a person. And so there's different parts to an internal and external safety plan. The internal, you're looking at coping skills, so distraction activities, identifying triggers, calming and relaxation techniques. These will look different depending on the culture that you're working with and the identity that you're working with. The calming and relaxation technique doesn't always look like lavender, essential oils, and taking bubble baths. Um, it might not be it might not look like the traditional DBT, so grounding exercises. For a lot of individuals, that is helpful, but it's also important to consider what kind of culturally specific resources are available to that person to help calm and relax them. Whether it be ceremony, whether it be a powwow, a mass, so religious, an event, being in community, it could be a really good calming and relaxation technique. Part of the internal, again, is the professional supports. So people identifying individuals to ask for help and to help make environments safe. So this could be a therapist, a psychiatrist, case manager, the advocate, so you, or the healers, the medicine people, the shamans, the individuals in community that they can speak to that will help them with their internal safety planning. Another part of this is awareness. So identifying warning signs of abusive behaviors, identifying triggers, identifying violence, and identifying when they need mental health assistance. So that doesn't always mean having to go to therapy to identify that. Sometimes that means speaking to an elder. Sometimes that means going to community or a religious leader that you can help. Let me see here. So external is exit strategies. So violence, anticipation of violence or after violence, evidence collection for legal remedies or medical exams, collecting evidence, identifying risk levels, and resource prevention. So that's collecting documents, and collecting medications, securing accounts and assets for an individual. And assessing safety. So when you're speaking with the individual, one thing to consider is your language. So what kind of language are you using as opposed to the type of language that the client is using? And language means a lot of things, but basically what I'm getting at is how you are identifying the individual and the person who's causing harm or violence on them. So if they are not identifying themselves as a victim, but you are identifying them and you're saying that they're a victim, it can be a really invalidating and uncomfortable experience for the individual. I know that this is the lingo that we use as professionals in our field, and grant writing and trainings, and we're used to saying victim perpetrator, but the clients that you're working with might not even register that they're experiencing violence. So calling them a victim right off the bat when you meet with them is overwhelming. And I know a lot of people, a lot of organizations use that standard, and they really, it's hard to get away from that language because it's everywhere. It's in the materials that you give the clients, it's in the intake, it's in the support groups, it's in the resources that you give somebody. There's victim, 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 victim. But all of that is not applicable to an individual if they are just recently experiencing violence, or if they have been, but they're accessing their resources for the first time. So be really mindful of how they are using their own language to describe their situation and reflect that. I usually start a safety plan with very open-ended questions, and I really want to get them talking so that it gives me enough time to register what kind of pronouns they use if they use them, what kind of experience that they've lived, what kind of culture, what their little tidbits of their relationship looks like, or their culture, their practices, their beliefs. You can find a lot about someone in 5-10 minutes of them talking. And part of that goal is to be looking for how they're using words to describe themselves and their perpetrator. So an example is assuming that they identify as a victim, like I said. And another part of that is pronouns. So waiting for the person to use their own pronouns. Someone who, how they are using pronouns to describe their perpetrator. This is extremely important for our queer community because the last thing you want to do is misgender someone when they've had the courage to access your resources. And that's really dangerous for a lot of people in the queer community for a lot of different reasons. Systems, communities, perpetrators. It's really scary for someone from the queer community to access resources. So when we do, it's really important for us to feel like we're safe with our pronouns. And I actually had someone mention at the last time I did this webinar, I have been used to addressing pronouns immediately when introducing somebody, and it was brought to my attention that asking pronouns outright could be a form of outing somebody, and it's usually really uncomfortable, especially if someone's still navigating their own pronouns. So I've that is very valid. So I think the safe route when addressing an individual is to use gender neutral, so they, them, or just use their name or the person's name if they have one. That's a good way around that without misgendering or outing somebody. And pronouns, for those of you who don't know, are the words that we use to identify someone as if they weren't in the room. That's a really good, quick way of explaining pronouns. So if someone left the room, how would you address them as? And another part of that is using people first language. So people before identities, basically. And good examples of that are if someone is struggling with addiction or alcohol abuse disorders, to call them an addict or an alcoholic is really painful for people. And trying to label their use also can be really problematic because they might not see their use as being a problem. So if you identify it as a problem, it can be really invalidating for someone who's experiencing substance abuse issues. So to call them an addict or an alcoholic is really derogatory. So to say someone living with substance abuse or struggling, even the word struggle I wouldn't suggest, but just to say someone living with a substance abuse or an alcohol abuse issue. Because you're acknowledging that this is a thing in their life, that it may or may not impact the safety plan, but you're not providing judgment on them. And of course, avoiding terms such as able-bodied, wheelchair-bound, crippled, handicapped, using someone, instead saying someone with a disability is more appropriate. And another part of when you're speaking with the victim and assessing for safety, to be mindful of the language that you're using. A lot of us tend to use the field jargon that we're used to as advocates and professionals, but a lot of the times when you're working with individuals, they might not know what you're talking about, and they might be too uncomfortable to confront you about it. So if you're someone who really likes vocab, you're really you like to use big words, you like to use very technical language, that's an issue sometimes with the individual, especially when you're navigating legal systems or formal reporting. when you're interacting with formal institutions and you're advocating for the individual, you really have to break it down in a way that they understand. And my role that I use is to speak as if you were teaching a class to third graders, because that is, for the most part, the standard level of education. And that's the standard comprehension level for individuals across a wide range of identities. So if you speak to someone that is from at a third grade reading level, that means that you understand the material enough to explain it and break it down to that point. That is really helpful in communicating with person. Let me see. How are we doing on questions?
There are no questions, but I
Okay.
did want to just include that I did attach the link again in the chat box for those of you that weren't able to open it prior, but I uploaded it under chat again. So let me know if you continue having issues with that, but I've been told that it's working now, so.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another important part when assessing safety is not to assume that someone is it's important. Sorry, I was reading my notes at the same time. So when you're talking with someone from a certain culture, it can be easy to blend different cultures that you know of and your education and your awareness, your contact with certain cultures, and associate it with someone else's culture. For example, an Anishinaabe person does not have the same belief system or traditions or ways as Sioux. They are two different tribes or two different cultures. They are both native, but they have different ways of thinking and different ways of utilizing their medicines and teachings to help their people. Same thing with Mexican. If you're dealing with Latino community, someone from Mexico thinks and has different needs as someone from El Salvador or Puerto Rico, something like that. So to assume that someone's from a Latino culture or indigenous culture, Black culture, that they have different categories within them. So it's really important that you are intentional on listening to them and seeing what exactly they need for culturally specific resources. Let me see here. So some barriers for underserved populations are, of course, language. When you're working with someone with limited English proficiency, our new Americans, our immigrants, refugees, undocumented, documented folks, first generation, English is a very complicated language. It's awful in a lot of different ways. There's different ways to describe things, and sometimes it doesn't translate. There's a lot of languages that we have words in English to describe violence very explicitly that don't exist in other languages. So if someone's trying to explain to you what they need and what's happening to them, and they're using an interpreter or they're using a very rudimentary form of translation like Google Translate. A lot of those words get missed. A lot of that essence gets missed. Details get missed. So when you're working with developing a safety plan with someone who has limited English proficiency and you're an advocate, it's important to know what your resources are. And I have a few links posted that are extremely helpful. I know for Spanish, there is a glossary of legal terminology that a group of individuals, there was an attorney, there's a community advocate, and then there, I believe, was a community leader. It was a group of people that sat down and developed a glossary that will translate legal terminology, so any words that might be used in the court system into Spanish, so that at least you have those terms. And I speak Spanish, so it looks very legitimate to me, but I can't really speak on the Hmong language in Somali, but those are the two other ones that I have found. I highly encourage you to do your own research because a lot of these are coming out. It's legal glossaries in different languages that can be really helpful to develop a safety plan with someone, especially if they plan on navigating the court system, especially if they plan on making a police report. And those terms can be very useful for you. And even if you're using an interpreter, they might not know what the legal term is. They might be able to describe what the word is in the language that they speak, but there might not be an actual word for it. So sometimes those terms can help the interpreter as well. Let me see here. Yes, individuals living with alcohol and substance abuse. So safety planning with those folks is difficult. It can be as difficult as someone who's chronically homeless or someone with extreme, severe and persistent mental illness, so SPMIs, in the sense that their lives are extremely unpredictable. It might vary from day to day depending on where they are, if they're using or if they're coming down from something, if they're trying to stay sober or if they're not trying to stay sober. They might be high or intoxicated when they're working with you, which also impairs their ability to engage in conversation, planning, remembering, and maintaining a conversation with you. It also puts a barrier between you and the client, especially if they're high or intoxicated. It makes it difficult to create a sustainable and appropriate safety plan for them. But if they are coherent with you, and it's important not to turn them away just because they're high or intoxicated. If they are coming to you with a certain level of coherency, they can sit, they can maintain contact with you. I would safety plan with them anyway, because the last thing you want is to turn them away, and they'll remember that when they're high, and then when they come, if they're coming down from something or if they're sober for a period of time and they still need help, they don't feel like they can come to you because you've already turned them away. So if you're able to, safety plan with those individuals as well. People are queer community, like I said, be conscious of gendered pronouns. So not all victims are female, not all perpetrators are male, not all victims are assaulted by a perpetrator of the opposite sex. Some same-sex sexual assaults will involve people who identify as LGBTQ. So assault happens, violence happens in the queer community, and it doesn't complicate things. It doesn't make the legal process any different. It doesn't make police reporting any different. You treat a queer person as you would a straight person, basically, and to think that they are different can be problematic, but when you're working with someone from the queer community, it's important to be conscious of the reasons why they might have hesitation around navigating those systems, as opposed to a straight person, but not to think that their gender or sexual orientation will affect the quality of a police report or the quality of a court process. And be conscious of your gender pronouns when you need clarification. Practice using terms like partner or significant other instead of boyfriend or husband when referring to someone's partner. Like we said, we don't want to assume gender on the client or the perpetrator. Because if someone comes into you, seek services from you, and their perpetrator is female, and you say him, and the person identifies as a female, and you say the perpetrator is a him, that's pretty invalidating. And the reason why it's invalidating is a lot of court cases are thrown out because the perpetrator is a female, which means they're not as strong. Why didn't you fight them off? Same, a lot of situations why a cisgendered male would have trouble convicting or getting charges. or protections against a female perpetrator. There's a lot of bias around same-gendered relationships. So if you refer to someone as a he all of the time, it just gives off the impression that their situation is not as dangerous because they're not dealing or experiencing violence from a cisgendered male. So be careful of your pronouns. Use partner. I use partner every time. Doesn't matter what gender, doesn't matter what sexual orientation. Partner is super neutral. And with our elder folks, it might be difficult because it's very likely that you'll be getting details and safety planning with a third party. So it's not common for an elderly person to seek services on their own. It is much more likely that you'll be working through a family member, care provider, friend, who's disclosing and accepting information for safety plans. So if you do safety plan with elders, definitely be patient. Realize that they come from a different time and they are not necessarily used to disclosure or safety planning or triggers or any of the language that we use, really. So allow them to visit instead of having an agenda. And the Elder Justice Center is really a good resource for that if you have someone who is calling on behalf of an elder or the elder themselves that need safety planning. So preparing to stay or leave, otherwise known as pre-exit versus post-exit. It's important to realize what the concept of safety from an advocate's perspective is and how it differs from an individual's concept of safety. Usually when an advocate's looking at safety, it means let's get them out of the house. We need to get them away from this person. We need to get them safe in their own place with their own resources, and that's what safety looks like. That might not be the case for the individual. A lot of individuals have a dependency in very, very different ways, very important ways on their perpetrators, on their abusers. If someone is a new American or has limited English proficiency and their perpetrator is the only one that speaks English, that is a sense of safety for the individual. And to take them away from that means they have to learn English or they have to be able to navigate their community in a way so that they can sustain themselves. That is scary. Learning English is really difficult. It's expensive in some cases, or it's just unattainable. A lot of people don't have formal education. A lot of people have had to drop out at very early ages. So safety on the person might mean financial or food or education, that if they left, they wouldn't know where to start or they wouldn't know where to begin, even with the resources that we give them to actually engage and utilize those resources can be really overwhelming for someone when they're deciding to stay or leave. And that someone has to think about these things. Where would I do? What can I do? How will I survive without this person? More importantly, for underserved populations, it's extremely scary to think about leaving the home that you have built with somebody and leaving the community that you rely on to sustain yourself independently. And that means that if they leave, that they're subject to discrimination, to systemic oppression, to verbal harassment, microaggression, all the things that people of color have to deal with that someone may or may not have had to deal with living in the home and being isolated. So it's not the best form of safety, but it is definitely a very valid form of safety for an individual who has all they've had to do with is they've been forced to stay in the home, provide for the children, communicate with people back home in their own country, and provide for the family. Now you're telling them that they have to leave and experience everything that people of color have to experience in the real world in trying to sustain themselves. That is extremely scary for someone, and they might not be used to it. They might not have the ability to cope with that. And all of the systemic barriers that they might have in trying to stabilize themselves. And a lot of people in community, if they do, first of all, if you leave, period, that is an excommunication from your own community, a community that you love, that's raised you, that's supported you. A lot of people frown upon leaving a significant other or disclosing that they were assaulted by a community member. A lot of communities are very tight-knit, so alliances get formed and relationships get broken. So leaving somebody is not just leaving an individual, but you're leaving a whole community. And some people are culturally but not legally married. So culturally married, cultural marriage looks a lot different from legal marriage in the sense that you don't get any of the benefits that the federal government or state government recognizes as a married couple. So you don't have any access to child support necessarily. You can get child support, but there's certain civil remedies that are affected if you're not legally married to an individual and you share children, let's say, or if you don't share children. The legal process will look different. And sometimes that's really scary. There's no financial security or relief assistance for people who are culturally but not legally married. And there's multiple types of cultures that do that. There's a lot of cultures that don't legally get married. Let me see here. Okay. So barriers, other barriers, I've already talked about a lot of them, but one barrier for our queer folks, our queer community, is isolation and outing. So outing is basically when someone has not identified as queer or as a certain gender to their friends, family, community, and the world, basically. They are not living openly with their sexuality or gender orientation. And outing is a abuse tactic that is used for perpetrators. If you leave me, I will tell your mother that you're gay. If you leave me, I will tell your mother that you're trans. And for a lot of people, that is devastating. They rely on their family, they rely on their community for support. A lot of folks in our rural areas or our religious communities have a lot of fear around outing and coming out as queer, as for obvious reasons, violence, basically. So when people are first coming out, they're very vulnerable to abuse. They might be losing friends and family already as a result of them coming out. They might be alienated from their cultural, ethnic, religious, or family community. They might lose their job. They might be bullied, or they might be subject to violence in their workplace or their education institution. They're already facing a lot of isolation, which leaves them vulnerable in the first place. So when you get a manipulative person who they're in a relationship with, the perpetrator will threaten to out somebody to if someone's not out to a certain type of person or a certain group, certain community. Let's say they only came out to their brother and the perpetrator knows that. So if they are getting ready to leave, they threaten to out themselves to the whole family, even though the brother was the safe person to disclose that information to. So threatening to out is a powerful tool of control, and it is often the reason why people stay in abusive relationships in the queer community. There is the concept of protective love for different types of experiences, but the examples that I'll use is for elders and for people experiencing substance and alcohol abuse. So protective love for elders is a lot of their perpetrators are family, are people that they love, people that they've raised, people that they've taken care of for decades, and people that they genuinely feel like need help. So a lot of the issue developing a safety plan with someone when they have protective love is that they don't see their perpetrator as a perpetrator. They don't see themselves as a victim. So, or they might see themselves as a victim, but they just have so much fear around getting that person in trouble, in getting that person arrested, getting that person killed if they're a person of color and they need police. Uh, that kind of protective love will prevent a lot of safety planning. It will prevent a lot of accessing of resources. It'll prevent a lot of quote unquote cooperation or ability to navigate and access and utilize the legal remedies that are available to them. Similarly, protective love as it pertains to substance and alcohol abuse, that protective love, that person, that perpetrator might be the supplier. That person might be the one who loves them and also provides them their substance or their alcohol. That person might be their dealer. That person might be their using buddy. So someone who's developed a strong bond through the drug use and alcohol use that they see every day, that they use with every day, that is there for them when they've overdosed. There's different types of love that that person has. So to get them in trouble, to disclose, to navigate, to safety plan, there's a lot of protection and fear. If they lose that person, they lose their substance. If they lose that person, they lose their using buddy. If they lose that substance, they lose that type of love that they've been used to, and that relationship with someone who cares about them. And when they've been rejected from their community and their family, um, losing that one person is really painful for someone. So that might mean that they'd rather stay in the relationship where they have access to their resources, they have access to their drugs or their alcohol, and they have access to that connection. Another part of this is citizenship. So if for our undocumented folks, a lot of people apply for citizenship when they're married to a citizen. They've applied to a work visa or a green card, and they have no safety plan when they leave. As we had a similar situation happen where someone wanted to divorce, but they were scared about their citizenship and how it would impact their citizenship. And it does impact their citizenship if they decide to divorce within a certain time frame. It's important to know whether or not they applied for a 2 or a 10-year green card. What kind of citizenship did they apply for with their partner? And if they need a removal of conditions or a divorce waiver. And I will not speak anymore on that because you can call Rachel on how citizenship and marriage will impact whether or not a person stays in an abusive relationship. So obviously small communities. I talked a lot about how rural and small communities might be affected by a disclosure of sexual violence or domestic violence situation. To develop a safety plan with the assumption that someone can get away from their perpetrator is assumptive and very unrealistic for folks who live in small communities. Our communities are much too small for this. Like we say, Indian country is tiny. A lot of people know other people. Immigrant communities are tiny. Even the LGBTQIA2S+, the queer community can be small. So to completely exclude the perpetrator from any type of interaction from an individual is simply it's irresponsible. It's not realistic, and that person will feel like they failed their safety plan if that's the goal of the safety plan. So for most individuals, it is the assumption that they will have contact with that person again. So we must, like I said before earlier, do harm reduction in our planning to avoid having the client feel like they need to completely isolate themselves from their community and their support system in order to avoid their perpetrator. Another point that might prevent somebody a barrier for our undocumented refugee immigrant folks is the concept of acculturation. So when someone moves to the US and has come from a country that has unstable laws, unstable government, unstable or non-existent rights around sexual domestic violence, they a lot of the times they don't even know that we have rights individually, or they have resources or legal process that will that they can utilize if they need to. And there's a lot of fear around navigating when you're a new American. Uh, there's a lot of fear around whether or not the rights exist. If they do, what kind of resources are available to them? A lot of the time, there's a lot of cultural pressure from home. So there's many countless examples of this, but one example is if someone is from a different country that comes to the US, lives with a family member to go to school. And the terms are if the person stays in school and helps pay utilities, that person can live with the family member. The family member is abusing them, but they still have pressure from home. It's hard for the individual to weigh their options. Do they disclose and risk being kicked out of the house? Do they disclose and risk being excommunicated from their family back home? They're stuck here. If they go back home and disclose, they could receive backlash from their family, or they could feel like they're letting them down. If someone's coming to the US working and providing for their family back home, and they disclose, that can be problematic too. So acculturation, the need and fear around not assimilating really, but to live in a new society, a new culture, comes with a lot of questions, a lot of fears, and a lot of confusion, basically. And I got this from a good resources from Casa de Esperanza. It's called the acculturation continuum, and it's a really good descriptor of what a lot of new Americans experience and when they come to this country and they're living here and they're experiencing violence. Uh, Let me see, I believe I covered all of that. Preparing to report or not to report. So involving police, basically, law enforcement. What can police do? So usually a general description of responsibilities for law enforcement when they respond to domestic violence or sexual violence call is to stop the abuse long enough for someone to escape, give a temporary restraining order, or if not, refer someone to a advocacy or court agency to ask for OFP or HRO. They might arrest the abuser, and they might help document the abuse. They might take pictures, interview witnesses. They might connect you to a local shelter or an agency. That's what the police are supposed to do. But we all know there is a lot of systemic issues when it comes to involving police and law enforcement. There is a disproportionate amount of police brutality on our Black community, our Native community, and especially trans and our queer community. There's high rates. I'm not a statistics person, so I'm not going to throw out numbers, but there is a lot of fear around involving police when it comes to communities of color, especially queer communities of color and Indigenous folks. Um, there's a lot of distrust in the system. There's a lot of previous involvement in the criminal system. Someone might have a bench warrant for a minor offense, and if they call the police, they could get arrested as well. Um, if they have a criminal record themselves and they call the police, they could also risk getting arrested even if they don't have a bench warrant. There's a lot of fear around law enforcement. So for our undocumented community, if they're calling the police, there is a very general assumption and very real assumption that ICE will also be present and they will be deported. There's a lot of past experience of violence. So if someone has never condoned or consented to the police being called and someone else calls the police, let's say a neighbor, there's a lot of risk of violence for that person. They might have been the one to be arrested and charged. They might have been the one to receive extreme violence, police brutality, harassment. Or even inaction. A lot of calls go uncalled, basically. There's a lot of people that call the police, and depending on what kind of neighborhood you're in, you'll wait 2-3 hours to make a report. There's a fear of retaliation in the community. So if you call the police and the community sees that you've called the police, that can be detrimental. That could be unsafe. That could be isolating. That could be receiving a lot of harassment from your own community. A lot of cultures do not condone the involvement of law enforcement. For our queer folks, for our queer community, especially trans individuals, they experience a lot of discrimination with both law enforcement and the medical system. So batterers know that. Perpetrators do know that if they call the police and their partner's trans, then they have a very strong argument that that person is the perpetrator, especially if they're trans males. Or black trans females. So if the police are called, there's a lot of misidentification of who the perpetrator is based on bias and homophobia. There's a lot of miseducation around gender and gender identity. So a lot of these folks are experiencing violence and experiencing discrimination. Especially with our individuals who are sexual assault victims, to go through a rape kit in a county or a hospital that is not informed on gender or sexual orientation, it can be extremely traumatic for an individual. There are a lot of people, there's a lot of good people out there that know how to provide a rape kit in a safe way that is informed for someone who identifies a certain way but has different genitals, or a queer person. But there's also a lot of uninformed individuals. So when you tell a queer trans person that they should get a rape kit, that means a lot more than you think it does. So a lot of individuals are scared to navigate police. They're scared to go to the hospitals. And when they're identifying and interacting with police, they're perceived to be in relationships. Oh, I actually do have a statistic from the Northwest Network. People who are perceived by police to be in relationships with someone of the same gender are 10 to 30 times more likely than people in different gender relationships to be arrested along with their abuser. So that's a classic thing. Either you go, he goes, or you both go. In same gender relationships, a lot of the time they both go. They both get arrested. They might not know that they can obtain civil legal remedies if you're queer or trans without involving the police. So not even just queer folks. You can make reports. You can do certain things without involving police. And a lot of people don't know that. So all they do is assume that if something happens, I have to call the police, but I don't want to, so I won't do anything. Another part of that, this image I actually provided earlier, is the fear, brutality, and incarceration of their abuser. So they might want them to leave, they might want to be safe, but they don't want to get the person arrested. And if you're a Black male, you are much more likely to get arrested and incarcerated. So that is not the goal. If that's not the goal of the person, it is very likely that they will not call the police, because they do not want to be the reason that they're incarcerating the father of their children, that their community will see them as someone who intentionally wants to incarcerate someone, and they are, it might be the assumption that they know that they can get that person arrested, so they do call the police. And a lot of people don't want that reputation in their community because it can be unsafe for them. Resources. So let me see here. Acknowledging barriers. So here are some resources that folks can use. Let's say you have a template from your organization, but you're working with someone who's queer, or someone with a different gender expression or identity. The Northwest Network, like I said, has a very awesome packet that you can use. When I scrolled through it, there's some really good templates on there that you could use. There's good things to take into consideration. It's not Minnesota-based resource, so Outfront would be the resource for that. But if you're looking for templates, the Northwest Network, the document's called "It Takes a Village, People." It provides some really good templates that you can utilize, and I would say take them and incorporate them into your safety plans. And for our Native community, Sacred Hoop Coalition has some really good resources. They have manuals that you can use when you're working with youth, elders, or Two-Spirit folks. There's some really good guides on how to advocate for sexual violence and how to refer to Native-specific resources in Minnesota. And there's a lot of them. And for our youth or our queer youth, I love this resource so much. I use it all the time. loveisrespect.org. It is an extremely interactive website. They have really good templates that you can use. They have interactive safety plans that you can use. You can download stuff. You can use the website. There's a lot of different ways to create a safety plan if you're looking with youth. Relocating. So a little thing on Safe at Home. I won't go too far into it. However, if you're unfamiliar with Safe at Home, definitely go to the website and look around on how address confidentiality might apply to your client. Sometimes for the most part, it is very solid. It is a very strong program for people if they qualify. If they don't qualify, or if they're incapable of maintaining their address confidentiality, then it can be a bit problematic and redundant. So just be safe and do research before you refer your client. And Maggie Olson and Shannon are the ones that will be mostly answering your questions at Safe at Home. They're really awesome. They're very well informed, and they will be able to answer really strange questions. I've called them a lot. So those are the links to those, and some things on Safe at Home. Safe at Home is not a good option if the client is planning on returning to their abuser. It's not a good option if the individual was assaulted in their home. It's not a good option if the individual owns their home. And it's not a good option if the individual is not capable or cannot receive help updating Safe at Home on their changes, and they can't maintain their confidentiality, they can't self-advocate for themselves, or they can't reapply when necessary. And similarly, it's not a good option if the individual is chronically homeless. There are mailboxes in the community that are provided to an individual. There's a lot of resources in the community for someone who's chronically homeless. And one of them I can think of in the metro area is St. Stephen's. They have a mailbox program. Um, so some takeaways on the presentation is that the client can refuse safety planning. You can't force them on anybody, and you shouldn't. If the person wants a safety plan, then it's important to listen to them to see what kind of safety plan makes the most amount of sense, and then go from there. Consider other professionals when safety planning. So a lot of people who are from underserved populations have multiple connections with different systems. So when I worked in shelter, you'd see any given client, pick one. A lot of the times they had open CPS cases. So they had a CPS worker, they had a guardian ad litem, they had a mental health professional, a psychiatrist, a general practitioner. If they're on probation, they had a probation officer. If they were in treatment, they had a case manager, a LADC, doing their rules and safety planning with them. If they had mental health, they had a case manager for that. Depending on what kind of housing, you have a housing case manager. So the point is, a lot of our clients have safety plans all over, all over in many different situations, in many different capacities. They might be juggling 10 or 12 different safety plans depending on their needs. And we're all trained, all of the professionals are trained to safety plan with individuals. Some people have to as a part of a treatment plan. So basically, that can be extremely overwhelming for someone if you sit them down and they are deciding to access resources, and you tell them that you need to do another safety plan. That can be, for some people, it's just way too much, and that alone will send them running because they already have all of these other ones that they have to keep track of. So that's what I was talking about with the verbal safety planning. If you know someone's coming in and they're explaining all of the different types of case managers and professionals and support networks that they have, it's really good that they have those. But also, if they're already working with all of those safety plans, just have a verbal conversation with them. Like, is this something that you'd want to keep? This is optional. This is harm reduction goal here. So if this is too much for you, we might work with the safety plans you already have and just throw in some DVSB specific components to that. And the last thing you want to do is overwhelm somebody, because I've seen people come in and they have whole folders full of safety plans that they have to complete, and they have goals, and they have notes that they have to take, and homework, and it's overwhelming for me, and I was a fully functional adult. So another part is building your network and listening to your community. If you have someone in your organization that works specifically with communities, certain communities, listen to them, see what is happening in communities. A lot of grassroots, non-funded people are doing amazing things in the community, and you might not even know about it. So to have that network and to have that resource and that information is really important. And to keep your resources in an accessible place, don't just hide them under a stack of binders and forget about them. If you're working with these templates, if you're downloading them and you're like, yes, I love that, I want to keep that, put that with your other safety planning templates so it's all in one place and you can navigate as you meet with a person and learn more about their needs and their identity. Knowing the service needs, issues, impact of services, the barriers is important to make safety plans and referrals. All of the examples that I gave you in the webinar are good things to keep in mind. I did it for you. So knowing service needs, not all of them. Those were just a few examples, but those are the types of barriers, the types of issues that we're seeing a lot. that you need to be informed on and know where to get that information. Who can you talk to about that? Confirm if you are going to refer somebody, make sure that it's safe. If you're not familiar with the program, um, make sure that you call ahead before you refer someone, especially from the queer community. Conversion therapy is very alive and well. There's different types of programs that may or may not be geared directly to the queer community that have very problematic and unsafe agendas. So um, do the work for that person and call ahead and ask if it's queer friendly. And if you don't know what that means, I would suggest talking to someone from out front, like, hey, I want to refer this person to this organization. I don't know if they're queer friendly. What questions should I ask to see if they're queer friendly? And you could do that same situation with someone who is undocumented. We need to be very protective of our clients, and the last thing we want is to refer them to some place that is not safe, especially when you're referring to mental health, to therapy, to medical professionals, to institutions that will be dealing with the brain or the body. It's really important to be mindful of whether or not they will be in good hands, because I guarantee you that there are some places here in Minnesota that I've heard from personal experience and very close connections that there are some unsafe organizations. There's unsafe hospitals, there's unsafe community clinics. So do that work beforehand before you refer somebody. And I believe that's all I have. Do we have any questions? I think we have about 10 minutes.
No, we don't have any questions, Marie, but since we do have 10 minutes and I didn't do this in the beginning of the webinar, I do want to remind folks that this webinar is being recorded and we do upload all of our webinars onto our YouTube page, Standpoint MN. So if you haven't checked out our YouTube page, please do so. We have lots of valuable webinars that have been recorded that you can use, go back in and get updated on training materials and things like that for new staff or even just to for yourself. And I also didn't talk about Standpoint for those that aren't familiar with us. Standpoint is a statewide organization. We're a team of attorneys and advocates working to assist individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking when it includes domestic or sexual violence. So we also provide technical assistance to systems professionals who interact with survivors. We facilitate trainings. We have an action line Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And so, you know, that's what we're here to do, is to provide answers to legal questions that you may have or your clients may have, and also provide options and identify resources for folks around the state of Minnesota. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, Ty, or to Marie. Marie's contact information is on there. But you know, we're always looking for suggestions for future webinars. And if you have input on the webinars that we have already done, you know, feel free to email me as well. My email is my first name, thi@standpointmn.org. And yeah, I just wanted to remind folks that we do record all our webinars and that you can go into a YouTube page and view those at your convenience. Do you have anything else, Marie?
I don't. I just want to thank everyone for attending. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, I love when people have feedback. If you saw something here that you want to talk more about, or if you have any additions or things to add that you've noticed from your community, let me know, because I did make some edits based off of my first PowerPoint that people brought to my attention. So I'm always looking for corrections. And if you have resources, send them. And yeah, gracias, miigwech. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar now, and please reach out if you have anything. Bye.